London, 1848. The newspaper trembled in Theodora Wilson's gloved hands. She stared at the notice, reading it for the third time, still unable to believe her sudden change in fortune. Governess required. For 2 children, ages 8 and 6. At Thornfield Hall, Yorkshire. Must be accomplished in music, drawing, French, and mathematics. Inquire at Caldwell House, London. The salary listed was double what she had earned at her previous position. It seemed almost miraculous after months of increasingly desperate circumstances. Since her father's death 6 months prior, leaving nothing but debts and a tarnished reputation, Theodora had been forced to rely on her skills as a teacher to survive. Miss Wilson? The butler appeared in the doorway of the sparse sitting room where she had been waiting for nearly an hour. His Grace will see you now. Theodora smoothed her plain grey dress, wishing for the 100th time that she could have afforded something more presentable. The garment was well made but showed signs of careful mending and had been fashionable 3 seasons ago. The butler led her through a series of elegant rooms, each more imposing than the last, until they reached a stately library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, interrupted only by tall windows that flooded the room with autumn light. Miss Wilson, Your Grace, the butler announced before withdrawing. The Duke of Caldwell stood with his back to her, staring out the window at the gardens below. His shoulders were broad beneath an impeccably tailored coat, his posture rigid and unwelcoming. When he turned, Theodora was struck by the severe handsomeness of his face, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw darkened slightly with stubble, and eyes the color of steel. He appeared to be in his early 30s, though the gravity in his expression suggested someone who had lived much longer. Miss Wilson. His voice was deep and controlled. I am James Caldwell, Duke of Caldwell. Theodora cursed, lowering her gaze respectfully. Your Grace. Please, sit. He gestured to a chair opposite a massive mahogany desk, then took his own seat behind it. He studied the papers before him. You were previously employed by the Ashworth family. Yes, Your Grace. For 3 years. And before that, you were educated at Mrs. Marchond's Seminary for Young Ladies. It wasn't a question, but Theodora answered anyway. Yes, Your Grace. Your references are adequate, he said, his tone suggesting they were barely so. Though I find it curious that a woman of your background would need to seek employment as a governess. Theodora stiffened. Had he heard the rumors? My circumstances changed after my father's passing, she said carefully. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. Ah, yes. Colonel Wilson. I believe I read of his misfortunes. Heat crept up Theodora's neck. Her father's gambling debts and the scandal of his suicide had been fodder for society gossip for weeks. The fact that she was the daughter of a gentleman had made the family's fall from grace all the more delicious to the scandal sheets. My father made some unwise investments, she said, the practice lie coming easily now. Is that what we're calling it? He asked, his voice cutting. Theodora lifted her chin. My father's mistakes are not my own, Your Grace. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise at her boldness. No, I suppose not. He shuffled the papers on his desk. My children require a firm hand, Miss Wilson. Their mother passed 3 years ago, and they have been difficult since. I'm very sorry for your loss, she said quietly. His face hardened. I don't require your sympathy, Miss Wilson, only your competence. Can you provide that? Yes, Your Grace. Very well. He rang a small bell, and the butler reappeared. Harrison will show you to your quarters. You'll meet the children tomorrow morning. Their previous governess left rather abruptly. Theodora thought she detected something unsaid in his tone. May I ask why? You may not. The Duke stood, indicating the interview was over. Good day, Miss Wilson. As Harrison led her through the vast house, Theodora wondered what she had gotten herself into. The Duke's coldness was unsettling, but the salary was too good to refuse. Whatever had happened with the previous governess, she told herself she could handle it. She had survived society's cruel rejection, surely she could manage 2 children and their forbidding father. Theodora awoke before dawn the next morning, anxiety having robbed her of restful sleep. Her room in the east wing was comfortable but modest, far from the family's quarters, as was proper for a governess. After dressing in her second-best gown, she made her way to the schoolroom where she would meet her charges. The room was bright and well-appointed, with 2 small desks, a larger one for herself, bookshelves filled with educational texts, and a pianoforte in one corner. Maps hung on the walls alongside framed botanical prints. It was clear no expense had been spared for the children's education. At precisely 8 o'clock, the door opened. A tall, severe-looking woman entered, followed by 2 small figures. "I am Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper," the woman announced. "These are Lady Charlotte and Lord Henry Caldwell." The children stood side by side, both fair-haired like their father but with eyes of deepest blue, their mother's legacy, perhaps. Charlotte, the elder at 8, regarded Theodora with open suspicion. Henry, just 6, stared at the floor, his small face pinched with what looked like anxiety. "Good morning," Theodora said warmly. "I'm Miss Wilson, your new governess." "How long will you stay?" Charlotte asked bluntly. Miss Perkins only lasted a fortnight. Mrs. Winters made a disapproving sound. "Lady Charlotte! Mind your manners." Theodora smiled. "I intend to stay as long as I'm needed, Lady Charlotte." "That's what Miss Perkins said," the girl replied, her voice tinged with skepticism. "And Miss Hammond before her. And Miss Layton before that. 3 governesses in quick succession?" Theodora's curiosity deepened. "Well, perhaps I shall prove more enduring than my predecessors." Henry finally looked up, his blue eyes serious. "Papa says we're ungovernable," he said in a small voice. "Lord Henry!" Mrs. Winters exclaimed. Theodora knelt before the boy, bringing herself to his eye level. "Do you believe that to be true?" He shrugged one small shoulder. "Miss Perkins cried every day." "I don't cry easily," Theodora assured him. To Charlotte, she added, "And I don't frighten easily either." The girl lifted her chin in a gesture so reminiscent of her father that Theodora nearly smiled. "We shall see." "Indeed we shall." Theodora stood and addressed the housekeeper. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters. We'll begin our lessons immediately." After the housekeeper departed, Theodora spent the morning assessing the children's educational progress. Charlotte proved to be bright but willful, challenging Theodora at every turn. Henry was quieter, his intelligence more cautious, but he followed his sister's lead in small acts of defiance, a deliberately dropped pencil, a sigh just loud enough to be disrespectful. By midday, Theodora understood why her predecessors had struggled. These were children testing boundaries, yes, but there was something deeper in their resistance, a wound still raw beneath their polished exteriors. When their luncheon arrived, Theodora noticed neither child ate much. "Are you not hungry?" she asked gently. "The food is always the same," Charlotte complained, pushing her plate away. "What would you prefer?" The question seemed to surprise the girl. "No one's asked us that before." "Well, I'm asking now." Charlotte exchanged a glance with her brother. "Cook used to make us jam tarts on Thursdays when Mama was alive." "An apple cake," Henry added, his voice brightening for the first time. "Perhaps we could inquire about having those again," Theodora suggested. Charlotte's expression grew guarded once more. "Papa says we mustn't bother the servants with special requests." "I see." Theodora considered this. "What if it's my special request, as your new governess? Surely I'm permitted to ensure you're properly nourished." A tiny smile flickered across Henry's face before he suppressed it. Charlotte merely shrugged, but Theodora caught the glimmer of hope in her eyes. After lessons concluded for the day, Theodora made her way to the kitchen, where she charmed the initially resistant cook into agreeing to prepare jam tarts for the following day. As she headed back to her room to prepare for dinner, which she would take alone, as governesses did not dine with the family, she nearly collided with the Duke in a dimly lit corridor. Your Grace, she exclaimed, stepping back hastily. I apologize. I didn't see you. His expression was unreadable in the shadows. How was your first day with my children, Miss Wilson? Enlightening, she replied honestly. They tested you, I presume. As all children test new authority. He studied her face. Yet you don't appear to be packing your belongings. Did you expect me to? A muscle tightened in his jaw. 3 governesses have left in the past 6 months. Miss Perkins lasted precisely 16 days before declaring my children impossible. Children are never impossible, Your Grace, Theodora said quietly. Merely misunderstood. A charming sentiment, he replied, his tone suggesting it was anything but. We shall see if you maintain it by week's end. I believe I shall. They're remarkably intelligent children. Lady Charlotte has a gift for languages, and Lord Henry shows promise in mathematics. Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, at hearing positive observations about his children. Is that so? Indeed. Though they would benefit from more, she stopped herself, remembering her place. More what, Miss Wilson? He prompted, his tone sharpening. She took a breath. More of your time, Your Grace. His expression hardened. You overstep. Forgive me, she said, lowering her gaze. It was not my intention. My relationship with my children is not your concern, he said coldly. Your duty is to educate them, not to criticize my parenting. Of course, Your Grace. He stepped past her, then paused. The children dine at 6. I expect them to be punctual and properly attired. Yes, Your Grace. As he walked away, Theodora released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The Duke's reaction confirmed what she had begun to suspect. He was as wounded as his children, though his defenses were built of ice rather than childish defiance. Weeks passed, and slowly, Theodora made progress with the children. The jam tarts had been a triumph, followed by other small victories, a genuine laugh from Henry during a French lesson, Charlotte asking for help with a difficult passage of music rather than abandoning the pianoforte in frustration. The Duke remained distant, but Theodora occasionally caught him observing them during their afternoon walks in the garden, his face inscrutable as he watched from his study window. One dreary afternoon in late October, rain kept them indoors. Theodora decided to try something different. Today, she announced, we shall put aside our usual lessons and have a poetry reading. Charlotte looked skeptical. We've already done our literature. This isn't for study. It's for pleasure. Theodora opened a slim volume she had brought from her room. My father used to read to me on rainy days. It made the gloom feel less oppressive. She began to read Wordsworth, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the verse. By the 3rd stanza, both children were listening intently, Henry's eyes wide with wonder, Charlotte's resistance softening. The door to the schoolroom opened, and the Duke entered. Theodora faltered midline. Your Grace, she said, rising quickly. The children scrambled to their feet. Papa, Charlotte said, surprise evident in her voice. I was passing and heard reading, he said stiffly. I thought perhaps lessons had gone astray. We're having poetry, Papa, Henry said, his voice eager. For pleasure, not for study. The Duke's gaze settled on Theodora. Is that so? Yes, Your Grace. The weather made our usual afternoon walk impossible, so we adapted. He studied the book in her hands. Wordsworth. Yes. I wandered lonely as a cloud. A shadow passed over his face. My wife was fond of Wordsworth. The room fell silent. It was the first time Theodora had heard him mention the Duchess. Charlotte broke the silence. Mamma used to read to us too, she said quietly. Before she got sick. The Duke's expression tightened. Yes, well. He cleared his throat. Carry on, then. He turned to leave, but Henry's small voice stopped him. Won't you stay, Papa? Miss Wilson reads beautifully. The Duke hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Theodora held her breath, afraid to speak lest she shatter the fragile moment. "I have matters requiring my attention," he said finally. But instead of leaving immediately, he crossed to the window and gazed out at the rain-lashed gardens. "Perhaps another verse before I go." Theodora resumed reading, her voice steadier than she felt. When she finished, the Duke nodded once and departed without another word. That evening, a package arrived at Theodora's door, a collection of poetry by Keats, with no note. The message was clear enough. The Duke had noticed her efforts and was, in his restrained way, encouraging them. The following Sunday, the Duke joined them for the carriage ride to church, something he had not done since Theodora's arrival. The children were clearly startled by his presence but said nothing. During the service, Theodora observed him watching Charlotte help Henry find the correct hymn page, a flicker of something like regret crossing his features. After church, rather than immediately returning to his study as was his habit, the Duke suggested they walk in the gardens, the previous day's rain having given way to weak autumn sunshine. "Lady Charlotte tells me you've been teaching them about botany," he said to Theodora as they strolled a respectful distance behind the children. "Yes, Your Grace. The gardens here are an excellent classroom. My wife designed much of it," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She had a remarkable eye for color and composition." Theodora glanced at him, sensing an opening. "The children speak of her often." His jaw tightened. "Do they?" "They miss her greatly." "As do I," he said, so quietly she barely heard him. Then, more firmly, "But life continues, Miss Wilson. We must all adapt to its cruelties. And to its joys, Your Grace." He looked at her sharply. "You find joy in your current circumstances? A gentlewoman reduced to servitude." The word stung, but Theodora refused to show it. "I find joy in teaching your children. In watching them learn and grow. That is no small thing." The Duke studied her face as if seeing her properly for the first time. "You're an unusual woman, Miss Wilson." "I'll take that as a compliment, Your Grace." It was intended as an observation. But the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but a softening of his habitual severity. Charlotte called to them then, eager to show her father a late-blooming rose she had discovered. To Theodora's surprise, the Duke indulged his daughter, examining the flower with apparent interest and answering her questions about when the bushes had been planted. That evening, as Theodora prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's events. Something had shifted, though she couldn't quite define what it was. The Duke remained reserved, even stern, but cracks were appearing in his armor, glimpses of the man who existed beneath the grief and formality. She told herself it was for the children's sake that she noticed these changes, that she cared only because their happiness depended on their father's healing. But in the privacy of her room, Theodora admitted a more troubling truth. She was beginning to care for the Duke himself, to wonder about the man he had been before sorrow had hardened him. It was a dangerous path for a governess, especially one with her precarious history. She must guard her heart more carefully. The Duke might be showing signs of softening toward his children, but his manner toward her remained that of employer to servant, cordial at best, dismissive at worst. Theodora extinguished her candle and closed her eyes, determined to remember her place. Yet sleep eluded her, her mind filled with images of steel-grey eyes that occasionally, fleetingly, revealed a soul in pain. November brought the first true cold of winter, and with it came illness. Henry developed a fever that rapidly worsened, his small body burning with infection as he struggled to breathe. The doctor was summoned immediately. He diagnosed inflammation of the lungs and prescribed various treatments, but by nightfall, Henry's condition had deteriorated further. Theodora refused to leave the boy's bedside, bathing his forehead with cool cloths and monitoring his labored breathing. The Duke paced the corridor outside, his face a mask of controlled terror. Shortly before midnight, Henry began to convulse. Theodora called for the Duke, who rushed to his son's side. "We need to lower his fever," she said urgently. "The bath must be filled with cool water, quickly." The Duke shouted for servants, his composure finally cracking. "If he dies," he began, then stopped, unable to continue. "He won't," Theodora said firmly, meeting his gaze. "I won't allow it." For hours they worked together, Theodora and the Duke, battling Henry's fever with cool baths and damp cloths. Charlotte watched from the doorway, her young face pale with fear until Mrs. Winters finally persuaded her to return to bed. Near dawn, Henry's fever broke. His breathing eased, and he fell into a natural sleep rather than the restless unconsciousness that had gripped him before. The Duke sat beside his son's bed, his face haggard with exhaustion and relief. Theodora moved to leave, feeling suddenly intrusive in this private moment between father and child. "Stay," the Duke said quietly. "Please." She sank into a chair on the opposite side of the bed, watching as the Duke gently brushed a lock of damp hair from Henry's forehead. "I thought I would lose him," he said, his voice raw. "As I lost her." "But you didn't," Theodora replied softly. "He's strong, Your Grace." "James," he said, looking up at her. "After what we've endured this night, I think you might call me James, at least in private." The intimacy of the moment, his given name on her lips, the shared vigil over his child, felt dangerous, yet Theodora couldn't refuse. "James," she said, testing the sound of it. They sat in silence as morning light began to filter through the curtains. Henry slept peacefully now, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. "You should rest," the Duke, James, said eventually. "You've been awake all night." "So have you." "I'm accustomed to sleepless nights." Something in his tone suggested those nights were filled with demons of memory rather than work. Theodora hesitated, then said softly, "The children need you. Not just your physical presence, but your heart." She expected anger at her presumption, but he merely sighed. "I know," he admitted. "I've kept them at a distance. After Elizabeth died, I couldn't." He stopped, struggling for words. "Every time I look at them, I see her. Charlotte has her eyes, her spirit. And Henry, his laugh." He shook his head. "It was easier to withdraw." "Easier," Theodora agreed, "but not better. For any of you." He studied her face, his expression unguarded for perhaps the first time since she had met him. "How did you become so wise, Miss Wilson?" "Theodora," she corrected gently, then added, "I've had my share of grief. My mother died when I was 12. My father was changed by it. As I have been changed. Perhaps. Though you still have a chance to find your way back." Henry stirred then, his eyelids fluttering open. "Papa," he murmured weakly. James leaned forward, taking his son's small hand. "I'm here, Henry. I'm right here." Theodora slipped quietly from the room, leaving father and son to their reunion. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion. The night had altered something fundamental between her and the Duke, James. The careful distance of employer and employee had narrowed, revealing the wounded humans beneath their respective roles. She knew she should be wary of this shift, this dangerous blurring of boundaries. Yet as she made her way to her own chamber, Theodora could not bring herself to regret it. Not when she had glimpsed the man beneath the Duke's stern facade, a man capable of deep love and terrible fear, a man who might yet heal if given the chance. Henry recovered slowly but steadily. During his convalescence, the Duke, Theodora still could not think of him as James except in unguarded moments, spent more time with both children. He read to Henry during long afternoons when the boy was too weak to leave his bed. He listened to Charlotte play the pianoforte, offering quiet praise that brought color to his daughter's cheeks. As November gave way to December and Christmas approached, the atmosphere at Thornfield Hall lightened perceptibly. The Duke still had moments of withdrawal and melancholy, but they were fewer, briefer, and he seemed to make a conscious effort to emerge from them rather than surrendering to their pull. One snowy evening, a week before Christmas, Theodora was summoned to the Duke's study. She found him standing by the fire, a glass of brandy in hand, his expression thoughtful. "You wanted to see me, Your Grace." He turned at the sound of her voice. "Yes, Miss Wilson." "Theodora." He set down his glass. I wish to discuss the children's Christmas celebrations. Of course. We have not, that is to say, since the Duchess passed, the holidays have been observed minimally. Theodora nodded, understanding. Many families in mourning subdued their celebrations out of respect. But 3 years have passed, he continued, and I begin to think perhaps we should make more of an effort this year. The children would be delighted, Theodora said carefully. They've mentioned traditions from before, decorating a tree, exchanging small gifts, special foods. Yes, Elizabeth was particularly fond of Christmas. His voice softened at the mention of his wife. She would fill the house with greenery and insist on games and carols on Christmas Eve. Those sound like beautiful traditions to revive, Theodora suggested. Not to replace what was, but to honor it. He studied her face. You have a gift for saying precisely what needs to be heard. Not always, she admitted. But in this, I speak from experience. After my mother died, my father abolished all celebrations. It only made her absence more painful, that deliberate void where joy should have been. The Duke nodded slowly. I believe I've made the same mistake. He moved closer, close enough that Theodora could see flecks of darker grey in his eyes. You've brought something back to this house, Miss Wilson. Something I thought had died with Elizabeth. Theodora's heart quickened at his proximity. What is that? Hope, he said simply. You've given my children hope that happiness is still possible. And perhaps... He hesitated. Perhaps you've begun to convince me as well. The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken possibilities. Theodora knew she should step back, re-establish proper distance, but she found herself unable to move. A knock at the door broke the spell. Harrison entered with a telegram for the Duke. James read it quickly, his expression darkening. It seems we will have company for Christmas after all, he said, his voice reverting to its former coolness. My sister-in-law, Lady Penelope Hurst, writes that she and her husband will arrive in 3 days' time. Theodora sensed his displeasure. Is that unwelcome news? Lady Penelope and I have a complicated relationship, he said diplomatically. She was very close to Elizabeth and has strong opinions about how I've raised the children since her death. I see. She will undoubtedly have equally strong opinions about you, he added, handing the telegram to Harrison with instructions for a reply. About me? Theodora echoed, confused. A governess with your particular background. He didn't elaborate, but his meaning was clear. Lady Penelope would know or discover the scandal surrounding Colonel Wilson's death. I see, Theodora said again, more stiffly this time. Should I prepare the children for their aunt's arrival? Yes. He hesitated, then added, I apologize if I spoke too plainly. Lady Penelope can be judgmental. As can society as a whole, Theodora replied. I've grown accustomed to it. You shouldn't have to be. There was genuine regret in his voice, and something else, a protectiveness that both warmed and alarmed her. Will that be all, Your Grace? The formality in her tone seemed to remind him of their respective positions. He straightened, the brief vulnerability vanishing from his face. Yes, Miss Wilson. That will be all. Lady Penelope Hurst arrived in a flurry of trunks and instructions, her voice carrying through the hall before she had even removed her travelling cloak. James! Darling, how positively medieval this place still looks. Have you considered brightening the entrance at least? Elizabeth always said it was like entering a mausoleum. The Duke greeted his sister-in-law with stiff courtesy. Penelope. I trust your journey was comfortable. Tolerable, though why you insist on remaining buried in Yorkshire when London offers so much more civilization is beyond me. Lady Penelope handed her cloak to a waiting footman and turned her attention to the children, who stood beside their father. Charlotte, Henry, come kiss your aunt. My goodness, Charlotte, how you've grown. You look so like your mother at your age. Theodora, observing from a discreet distance, saw the Duke's jaw tighten at the comparison. Lady Penelope finally noticed her. And who is this? Miss Wilson, the children's governess, the Duke replied. Miss Wilson, Lady Penelope Hurst. Theodora cursed. My lady. Lady Penelope's gaze was assessing, sharp with intelligence and something like suspicion. Wilson, that name seems familiar. Miss Wilson has been with us for nearly 2 months, the Duke interjected smoothly. The children have made excellent progress under her tutelage. Have they indeed? Lady Penelope turned back to the children. Well, we shall have to see about that. I brought Christmas presents, of course. And Edward will join us tomorrow, he had business in York that couldn't wait. As they moved toward the drawing room, Lady Penelope linked her arm through the Duke's, already chattering about mutual acquaintances and London gossip. Theodora remained behind, knowing her presence would not be required for family tea. Later that evening, as Theodora helped Charlotte prepare for bed, the girl asked hesitantly, "Do you like Aunt Penelope?" "I've only just met her," Theodora replied diplomatically. "But she clearly cares for you and your brother." Charlotte made a face. "She's always telling Papa what Mama would have wanted. It makes him angry, though he pretends it doesn't." "Your aunt misses your mother too," Theodora suggested gently. "Sometimes people express grief in ways that seem intrusive to others." The girl considered this. "She won't like that you're here. She wanted Papa to hire her friend Mrs. Barton as our governess, but Papa refused." "Did he?" Theodora hadn't known this. "Well, I'm grateful he chose me instead." "So am I," Charlotte said with unusual warmth. "Mrs. Barton visited once. She smelled of lavender and spoke to us as if we were infants." Theodora smiled. "A grave offense indeed." "Aunt Penelope will try to make you leave," Charlotte warned, her expression serious again. "She always gets her way eventually." "Does she?" Theodora tucked the blankets around the girl. "Well, I'm not so easily dislodged." "Promise?" The naked hope in Charlotte's voice tugged at Theodora's heart. "I promise to do everything in my power to stay as long as you need me." It was a careful promise, hedged against circumstances beyond her control, but it seemed to satisfy Charlotte. The girl closed her eyes, and Theodora left the room with a growing sense of unease about Lady Penelope's arrival. Her concerns proved justified the very next morning. As Theodora conducted lessons in the schoolroom, the door opened to reveal Lady Penelope, elegantly dressed for a morning at home. "I hope you don't mind my observation," she said, though her tone made it clear she didn't care whether Theodora minded or not. "I've always taken an interest in the children's education." "Of course, my lady," Theodora replied, gesturing to a chair. "We're currently working on French conversation." Lady Penelope settled herself and watched with a critical eye as Theodora guided the children through a dialogue about a visit to a Parisian market. When they had finished, she addressed Charlotte directly. "Your accent has improved, though there's still that troublesome difficulty with the letter R. Your mother spoke French like a native, you know." Charlotte's face fell slightly. "Yes, Aunt. You've told me." Lady Penelope turned to Theodora. "Miss Wilson, I wonder if we might have a private word after your lessons conclude." "Certainly, my lady." The rest of the morning passed in uncomfortable awareness of Lady Penelope's scrutiny. When the children were finally released for their midday meal, Theodora steeled herself for the coming confrontation. "Miss Wilson," Lady Penelope began once they were alone, "I'll be direct. I've made inquiries about you." "I see. Your father was Colonel Jonathan Wilson, was he not? The same Colonel Wilson whose financial improprieties and subsequent suicide caused such a scandal last spring." Theodora kept her expression neutral despite the pain that lanced through her at the callous reference to her father's death. "Yes, my lady." "And you think yourself a suitable influence for the Duke of Caldwell's children?" "I believe my own character stands separate from my father's mistakes," Theodora replied evenly. "As does my ability to educate Lady Charlotte and Lord Henry." Lady Penelope's eyes narrowed. "There are whispers, Miss Wilson, that your father's gambling debts were not his only indiscretion. That certain investments were made with funds that did not belong to him. Rumors often exceed the truth, my lady." Perhaps. But the Duke has a position to maintain. The scandal of employing a governess with such connections, the Duke was fully aware of my background when he hired me, Theodora interrupted, her patience fraying. He deemed it irrelevant to my qualifications. Did he indeed? Lady Penelope looked skeptical. James has always been impulsive in his decisions. It's why Elizabeth was such a steadying influence for him. She rose, smoothing her skirts. I only have the family's best interests at heart, Miss Wilson. Surely you can see that a governess with your history poses a risk to the children's social standing. What I see, Theodora said carefully, is that the children have thrived these past weeks. They're learning eagerly, they're beginning to heal from their loss, and they're forming a closer relationship with their father. I respectfully suggest that disrupting their lives now would harm rather than help them. Lady Penelope's expression hardened. You presume a great deal, Miss Wilson. The children's relationship with their father is hardly your concern. As their governess, their well-being is precisely my concern. And is that all you are? Their governess. Lady Penelope's voice carried a dangerous insinuation. The servants talk, you know. They've noticed how often the Duke seeks your company, how his manner changes when you enter a room. Heat rose in Theodora's cheeks. You misunderstand, my lady. The Duke consults me about his children's education, nothing more. For your sake, I hope that's true. Lady Penelope moved toward the door. My sister loved those children more than life itself. I will not stand by and watch them be influenced by someone of questionable character, nor see James entangle himself with a woman so far beneath his station. She departed before Theodora could respond, leaving behind a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. Theodora sank into her chair, shaken by the confrontation. Lady Penelope's insinuations about her relationship with the Duke were baseless, yet she couldn't deny that something had shifted between them, something undefined but undeniably present. That evening, Theodora kept to her room, sending word that she had a headache and would take her dinner there. She needed time to think, to consider Lady Penelope's accusations and decide how to proceed. If her presence truly threatened the children's standing, was it selfish to remain? A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find the Duke himself standing in the corridor, his expression concerned. Miss Wilson. Theodora. You're unwell. A mere headache, Your Grace. Nothing serious. He studied her face. May I come in? I need to speak with you. Propriety dictated she refuse. A man in her private chambers, even with the door open, would cause gossip. But something in his expression made her step aside. Penelope spoke to you today, he said without preamble once he had entered. Yes. She's also spoken to me. His voice was tight with controlled anger. She suggested I dismiss you immediately, for the sake of the family's reputation. Theodora's heart sank. I see. Do you? He moved closer. Do you see that I refused? That I informed her in no uncertain terms that you have been the best thing to happen to this household in 3 years, and that I would sooner dismiss her than you. Hope flared, but Theodora tamped it down. Your Grace, James, he corrected. Please. James, she conceded. Lady Penelope's concerns are not entirely without merit. My father's actions have cast a shadow over my name. Society has a long memory for scandal. Society can go to hell, he said with sudden vehemence. I've lived my life according to its dictates for too long. I married as was expected of me, maintained appearances as was expected of me, withdrew from my children after Elizabeth's death as was expected of me in my grief. He ran a hand through his hair. And what has it brought me? 3 years of misery, 2 children growing up without knowing their father's love, a house that felt more like a tomb than a home until, he stopped abruptly. Until? Theodora prompted softly. Until you arrived, he finished, his voice dropping. You've brought life back to Thornfield Hall, Theodora. Light and warmth and hope. The children smile again. They laugh. They ask questions instead of hiding from me." He took her hand, a gesture so unexpected she nearly pulled away. "And I find myself looking forward to each day rather than merely enduring it." Theodora's pulse quickened at his touch, at the earnestness in his voice. "The changes in the children are their own doing," she said. "They only needed permission to be themselves again. Permission you gave them. Permission you somehow extended to me as well." His thumb traced a gentle pattern on the back of her hand. "I don't know what this is between us, Theodora. I only know that when I'm with you, I feel as though I'm awakening from a long sleep." The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Theodora knew she should withdraw her hand, remind him of their respective positions, the impossibility of whatever was growing between them. But she found herself unable to speak, unable to break the tenuous connection. A floorboard creaked in the corridor, reminding them they were not truly alone. James released her hand and stepped back, his expression regretful but resolved. "I won't dismiss you," he said firmly. "Not for Penelope's misguided concerns, not for society's judgment, not for anything but your own desire to leave. Remember that." He departed, leaving Theodora standing in the middle of her room, her hand still warm from his touch, her mind tumultuous with conflicting emotions. Christmas Eve arrived with swirling snow and a tangible excitement throughout the house. Despite Lady Penelope's obvious displeasure, James had insisted on reviving many of the traditions his wife had cherished. Evergreen boughs festooned the banisters, holly and mistletoe hung in doorways, and a magnificent tree stood in the drawing room, awaiting decoration by family hands. Theodora had kept a careful distance from the Duke since their encounter in her room, focusing on the children and the holiday preparations. Lady Penelope watched her constantly, her gaze calculating whenever Theodora and James were in the same room. Sir Edward, Lady Penelope's husband, had arrived as promised, bringing a jovial presence that somewhat lightened the tension. As twilight fell, the family gathered in the drawing room to decorate the tree. Theodora had intended to remain in her room, but Charlotte had insisted she join them. "You must help, Miss Wilson," the girl had pleaded. "You know where the ornaments look best." So Theodora found herself part of the family circle, handing delicate glass baubles to the children and helping Henry reach higher branches. Lady Penelope directed proceedings with authoritative flair, while Sir Edward told amusing stories of Christmas mishaps from his childhood. James stood slightly apart, watching his children with a quiet joy that warmed Theodora's heart each time she glanced in his direction. When the tree was finally decorated, candles were carefully lit among its branches, casting a golden glow over the room. "It's beautiful, Papa," Charlotte breathed, her face transformed by wonder. "Indeed it is," he agreed, moving to stand beside his daughter. "Your mother would have approved." For once, the mention of Elizabeth brought smiles rather than shadows. Even Lady Penelope's expression softened as she gazed at the tree. "She always did have the most extraordinary taste," she said, her voice gentler than Theodora had yet heard it. "Do you remember, James, how she insisted on gold ribbons rather than red? So unfashionable at the time, but how right she was." "She was right about many things," James agreed. Henry tugged at his father's sleeve. "May we have the Christmas story now? Mama always read it on Christmas Eve." A brief pain crossed James's face, but he nodded. "Yes, of course." Lady Penelope reached for the Bible on a nearby table. "I'll read it, just as Elizabeth did." But Henry shook his head. "I want Papa to read it." A charged silence fell over the room. James looked momentarily startled, then deeply moved. "If you wish it, Henry," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. He accepted the Bible from Lady Penelope, whose expression wavered between annoyance and grudging approval. As James began to read the familiar verses, his deep voice filling the room, Theodora watched the children's faces. They sat at their father's feet, attentive and peaceful in a way she had rarely seen them. This, she realized, was healing, not the absence of pain, but its transformation into something that could coexist with joy. Later, after the children had been sent to bed with promises of presents in the morning, the adults gathered for hot punch in the library. The atmosphere had relaxed considerably, aided by Sir Edward's genial conversation and the festive spirit of the evening. "I must say, Miss Wilson," Sir Edward remarked, "the children seem remarkably well behaved and educated. Their French pronunciation is far better than mine ever was, despite years of expensive tutors." "Thank you, Sir Edward," Theodora replied, warmed by the praise. "They're extremely bright children." "Yes, well, they come from good stock," Lady Penelope interjected. "Elizabeth was extraordinarily accomplished." "As is Miss Wilson," James said firmly. "She speaks 4 languages fluently, plays the pianoforte with remarkable skill, and has a depth of scientific knowledge that continually surprises me." Lady Penelope's lips thinned at his defense, but Sir Edward nodded approvingly. "Excellent credentials for a governess. Were you educated abroad, Miss Wilson?" "At Mrs. Marchand Seminary for Young Ladies in Bath," Theodora replied. "My father believed in education for women." "Colonel Wilson," Lady Penelope said pointedly. "I believe I knew of him. Wasn't there some unfortunate business last year?" The room grew suddenly tense. Theodora's cheeks warmed, but she kept her voice steady. "My father made some unwise decisions toward the end of his life," she said carefully. "He paid for them dearly." "With his life, as I recall," Lady Penelope pressed. "After embezzling from his regiment's widow and orphan fund. Quite the scandal." "Penelope," James warned, his voice hardening. "That's enough." "Is it?" Lady Penelope set down her glass with deliberate precision. "I merely think it's important to acknowledge Miss Wilson's background openly, since you seem determined to keep her in your household despite it." Sir Edward looked uncomfortable. "My dear, perhaps this isn't the time." "When is the time, Edward?" "When the gossip reaches Yorkshire. When Charlotte and Henry are shunned by proper society because their father employed the daughter of a disgraced suicide as their governess." She turned to Theodora. "No offense intended, Miss Wilson, but surely you see the impropriety of your position." Theodora stood, her composure threatening to crack. "If you'll excuse me, I think it best that I retire." "Theodora, wait," James said, rising as well. "Let her go, James," Lady Penelope insisted. "This conversation concerns the family's welfare. Miss Wilson is merely an employee." Something in James's expression changed, a hardening, a resolution forming. "No," he said quietly. "She is considerably more than that." The words hung in the air, laden with implication. Lady Penelope's eyes widened. Sir Edward suddenly became very interested in the pattern of the carpet. "James," Lady Penelope said carefully. "Whatever you're thinking, what I'm thinking," he interrupted, "is that I've allowed you to dictate terms in my household for far too long, Penelope. You've criticized my parenting, my choices, my very way of grieving, all under the guise of preserving Elizabeth's memory." "Because someone had to," Lady Penelope exclaimed. "You withdrew from everything and everyone after she died. The children were being raised by strangers while you brooded in your study." "Yes," James admitted, his voice softening slightly. "I failed them. I failed Elizabeth's memory. But I am trying to make amends now, and Miss Wilson has been instrumental in helping me do so." He moved to stand beside Theodora, not quite touching her but close enough to make his allegiance clear. "Her background is irrelevant compared to the good she has done for this family." Lady Penelope studied them both, her shrewd eyes taking in their proximity, the tension between them. "I see," she said finally. "It's like that, is it?" "It's not," Theodora began, but James interrupted. "It's exactly like that," he said firmly. "Or it will be, if Miss Wilson will have me." The words seemed to surprise even him, as though he hadn't intended to speak them aloud. Theodora stared at him in shock, unable to form a response. Lady Penelope recovered first. "Have you lost your mind?" she demanded. "The Duke of Caldwell cannot marry his children's governess, especially not one with her particular history." "Cannot?" James echoed, his voice dangerously quiet. "I think you'll find, Penelope, that as master of this house and my own destiny, I can do precisely as I choose." Sir Edward cleared his throat. Perhaps we should all retire for the evening, he suggested diplomatically. It's Christmas Eve, after all. A time for peace and goodwill. But Lady Penelope was not to be deterred. James, I implore you to think of the children, of your position, of what Elizabeth would have wanted. Elizabeth would have wanted me to be happy, James said firmly. She told me so, in her final days. She made me promise not to bury myself with her. His voice caught. A promise I broke until Theodora showed me how to live again. The nakedness of the confession stunned them all into silence. Theodora felt tears threatening and blinked them back, unwilling to display such vulnerability before Lady Penelope's calculating gaze. I think Sir Edward is right, she said quietly. We should all retire. Tomorrow is Christmas, and the children deserve a joyful day unmarred by complications. James looked as though he wanted to object, but after a moment, he nodded. As always, Miss Wilson, your concern for the children comes first. They parted in strained silence, Lady Penelope and Sir Edward heading to their chambers while Theodora and James remained briefly in the library. I apologize, he said once they were alone. I shouldn't have spoken so openly before Penelope. It was unfair to put you in such a position. Did you mean it? Theodora asked, her heart racing. What you implied about us? He moved closer, taking her hands in his. Every word, he said softly. I know it's sudden. I know there are 1,000 reasons why it's impossible. But I find I no longer care for impossibilities. His thumbs traced gentle circles on her skin. You've brought me back to life, Theodora. I won't return to the half-existence I endured before you came. James, she whispered, overwhelmed by his declaration. Society will never accept such a match. Lady Penelope is right, my father's disgrace, my position as governess. Society accepted my first marriage, and it brought me joy for a time, then unimaginable pain, he replied. Perhaps it's time I made choices based on what will truly bring happiness, not just what is expected. The longing to believe him, to embrace the future he offered, was almost overwhelming. But Theodora forced herself to step back, to create distance between them. We should not discuss this tonight, she said, though it cost her to say it. There's too much emotion, too much at stake. He looked as though he would argue, but then nodded reluctantly. You're right, of course. Always so sensible. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture both courtly and intimate. But this conversation is not finished, Theodora. Merely postponed. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and slipped from the library, her mind in turmoil and her heart singing with dangerous hope. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the grounds of Thornfield Hall transformed into a glistening white expanse. Theodora had barely slept, her mind replaying James's words, imagining possibilities both wonderful and terrifying. By the time she dressed and made her way downstairs, the children were already awake and eager to open presents. The drawing room had been transformed overnight. Stockings hung from the mantel, filled with small treats and toys. Presents were arranged beneath the tree, wrapped in colorful paper and ribbons. The children bounced with excitement, while James watched them with undisguised affection. Lady Penelope and Sir Edward joined them shortly after Theodora arrived, Lady Penelope's manner noticeably cooler than the previous evening. She avoided looking directly at Theodora and spoke to James only when necessary. The gift opening proceeded with appropriate excitement from the children. Charlotte received books, drawing supplies, and a beautiful music box that played her favorite melody. Henry was given toy soldiers, a wooden train set, and a magnifying glass for his budding interest in insects. Theodora had purchased modest gifts for her charges, a journal with Charlotte's initials embossed on the cover, and a collection of pressed butterflies for Henry. The children thanked her with genuine warmth, Charlotte even embracing her impulsively. I have something for you as well, Miss Wilson, James said, holding out a small package wrapped in silver paper. Lady Penelope's eyebrows rose, but she said nothing as Theodora accepted the gift with murmured thanks. Inside was a first edition of Wordsworth's poems, bound in soft leather with gilt-edged pages. The inscription inside read simply, "For bringing poetry back to Thornfield Hall." "It's beautiful," Theodora said softly, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "Thank you." "I'm glad you like it," James replied, his eyes conveying far more than his words. The moment was interrupted by Henry tugging at Theodora's sleeve. "Miss Wilson, you haven't opened Charlotte's and my gift yet." He presented her with a small, clumsily wrapped package. Inside was a watercolor painting, clearly done by the children together, Charlotte's precise brushwork forming the background of Thornfield Hall, with Henry's more exuberant strokes creating figures in the foreground, a tall woman with brown hair, two smaller figures, and a man standing beside them. "It's our family," Henry explained earnestly. "See? That's you, and that's me and Charlotte, and that's Papa." The word family hung in the air, charged with meaning. Theodora glanced up to find James watching her, his expression soft with emotion. Lady Penelope's lips had thinned to a nearly invisible line. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received," Theodora told the children, her voice thick with genuine feeling. "I shall treasure it always." The rest of Christmas Day passed in a blur of activities, a sumptuous dinner, games in the drawing room, carols around the pianoforte. Throughout it all, Theodora was acutely aware of James's gaze following her, of the unspoken conversation suspended between them. Lady Penelope watched them both with narrowed eyes but held her peace, perhaps mindful of the children's happiness. That evening, after the children had been put to bed with new toys clutched in sleeping hands, Theodora made her way to the library. She needed solitude to think, to consider the impossible choice before her. The room was dark save for the fire burning low in the grate, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. She had not expected to find James already there, standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. He turned at the sound of the door opening. "Theodora," he said softly, as though he had been waiting for her. "I apologize," she said quickly. "I didn't realize you were here. I'll leave you to your privacy." "No, stay. Please." He moved toward her. "I've been hoping for a moment alone with you all day." She remained by the door, suddenly uncertain. "James, what you said last night. I meant every word." He stopped a few feet from her, respecting her need for distance. "I know it must seem sudden to you, perhaps even foolish." "Not foolish," she corrected. "Impossible." "Nothing is impossible if we have courage enough to pursue it." He took a step closer. "Theodora, I know there are obstacles, your position, your father's history, society's expectations. But none of them matter compared to what I feel when I'm with you." Her heart raced at his words, but she forced herself to be practical. "And what of the children? How would they feel about their governess suddenly becoming their stepmother?" A smile touched his lips. "Did you not see Henry's painting? They've already accepted you as part of our family." He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "Charlotte asked me yesterday if you would always stay with us. When I asked what she would think if you were to become more than her governess, she said, 'I should like that very much, Papa.'" Tears pricked at Theodora's eyes. "They're such wonderful children." "They are. And they've flourished under your care." His thumbs brushed gently over her knuckles. "As have I." "James," she whispered, feeling her resistance crumbling. Even if I were to accept what you're offering, Lady Penelope is right. Society would never approve. You would be ostracized, the children would suffer, society will adapt," he said firmly. "I am not without influence. My title, my fortune, they count for something in this world, however shallow that may be. There would be gossip, yes, but it would fade." His expression grew serious. "Unless you fear the scandal would be too painful for you to bear. I would understand if—" "No," she interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I've endured society's judgment already. I fear it for your sake, for the children's, but not for myself." Hope brightened his eyes. "Then is there any other objection? Any reason why you could not consider becoming my wife?" The word wife sent a tremor through her. Only that I can scarcely believe this is happening, she admitted. 3 months ago, I was desperate for any position, certain my future held nothing but drudgery and loneliness. And now? And now, he prompted gently. Now I find myself falling in love with a man I never thought could return such feelings, she whispered. A man whose children have captured my heart as surely as he has. James's breath caught. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he drew her closer. Is that a yes, Theodora Wilson? Will you marry me? She looked up into his face, seeing the hope and vulnerability there, the love that had grown between them despite every circumstance that should have prevented it. Yes, she said softly. Yes, James Caldwell, I will marry you. His kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. When she responded, her arms slipping around his neck, the kiss deepened, becoming a promise of all that would follow. They broke apart only when the library door opened suddenly, revealing a startled Lady Penelope. I was looking for Sir Edward, she stammered, clearly shocked by the scene before her. James kept his arm around Theodora's waist, unwilling to release her. Penelope, he acknowledged. I believe Edward retired early. He mentioned a headache. Lady Penelope seemed to recover her composure. I see you've made your decision, then, she said stiffly. I have, James confirmed. Miss Wilson has agreed to become my wife. Something complicated passed over Lady Penelope's face, disapproval, resignation, and perhaps a grudging respect. Elizabeth would have had strong opinions about this match, she said finally. Yes, she would have, James agreed. She would have said life is too precious and too short to deny love when it finds you. His voice softened. She would have wanted me to be happy again, Penelope. You know that. Lady Penelope was silent for a long moment. Then, with visible effort, she inclined her head slightly. I suppose she would have, at that. She fixed Theodora with a penetrating stare. You will have a difficult road ahead, Miss Wilson. Society will not make this easy for either of you. I'm aware, Theodora replied steadily. But I believe what we're building is worth the struggle. A hint of approval flickered in Lady Penelope's eyes. Well, perhaps you have more backbone than I gave you credit for. She moved toward the door, then paused. I suppose I should offer congratulations. When do you plan to announce the engagement? James glanced at Theodora, who nodded slightly. After the new year, he said. We'll allow the children time to adjust to the idea, though I think they'll be more accepting than most. Undoubtedly, Lady Penelope agreed dryly. Well, I shall save my felicitations for the official announcement. Good night, James. Miss Wilson. She departed, leaving them alone once more. That went better than expected, James remarked, drawing Theodora back into his embrace. She's not fully reconciled to the idea, Theodora pointed out. No, but she will be. Penelope's bark is worse than her bite, and she loves the children too much to maintain her opposition once she sees how happy they are. Theodora rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Are we truly doing this? She asked softly. It still seems like a dream. The most real dream I've ever known, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. We'll face whatever comes together, Theodora. The gossip, the disapproval, all of it. And we'll build something beautiful from the ruins of the past, for ourselves, for Charlotte and Henry, for the future. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the windows like blessings. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Theodora and James stood on the threshold of a new life, their broken pieces finally finding wholeness in the most unexpected of places, in each other. 6 months later, on a perfect summer day, Theodora Wilson became the Duchess of Caldwell in the small chapel at Thornfield Hall. Charlotte served as her bridesmaid, while Henry proudly carried the rings. Lady Penelope, now grudgingly supportive, arranged the flowers and ensured the wedding breakfast was flawlessly executed. Society gossip had indeed flared when the engagement was announced, but as James had predicted, his influence and wealth had muted the worst of it. There were those who would never accept the match, who would always whisper behind fans and raised hands about the governess who had risen above her station. But there were others, friends of true heart and open mind, who saw the happiness in the Duke's once somber face and welcomed Theodora into their circle. As she stood in the garden after the ceremony, watching Charlotte teach Henry a new game while James spoke with guests, Theodora reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. From near destitution to duchess in less than a year, it was the sort of transformation found in fairy tales rather than real life. "You look thoughtful, my love," James said, appearing at her side and taking her hand. "Having second thoughts already?" She smiled up at him, her heart full. "Only thoughts of gratitude," she assured him. "For you, for the children, for this second chance at happiness that I never expected to find." He lifted her hand to his lips. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day? About children never being impossible, merely misunderstood." "I do." "You were right. And not just about children." His gaze was tender as it rested on her face. "Some might say a duke marrying his children's governess was impossible. But we were merely misunderstood, by society, perhaps by ourselves at first." "Thoroughly understood now, I think," she replied, leaning into him as Charlotte's laughter rang out across the garden. "Thoroughly," he agreed, his arms circling her waist. "And thoroughly loved, Duchess." The title still felt strange to her ears, but the love in his voice was as familiar as her own heartbeat. Together, they had rebuilt what grief and scandal had broken, not erasing the past, but transforming it into the foundation of something stronger and more beautiful than either had dared to imagine. As the summer day lengthened into golden evening, the Duke and his new Duchess walked among their guests with the quiet confidence of those who have faced the impossible and emerged victorious. And when they danced beneath the stars, witnessed by Charlotte and Henry's delighted eyes, it was not just a waltz but a promise, of healing completed, of love triumphant, of souls no longer broken but made whole again in each other's arms.